Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody. I'm Anya Schifrin. I'm the director of the Technology and Media program at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. And we're really delighted to host this event also with Columbia Journalism School to consider how political coverage has changed, need to change, could change in the run up to the midterm and the 2024 elections. After Trump was elected, there was a lot of discussion and sort of self-flagellation, I think, after 2016. Journalists love criticizing themselves. And so there was a lot of question about, was too much amplification given to the fringe? Did Trump get more uncritical coverage than he deserved? Were the Hillary Clinton emails overreported? Was there an imbalance? So those were some of the debates that happened before and sort of right after the Trump victory. And then we started looking at other questions as well, which is, how do you cover somebody who lies? There were so many norms that were broken during the Trump presidency that it became sort of perplexing for journalists. How do you cover both sides when one side's lying? What do you do when one political party descends into conspiracy theories? So I think that these are incredibly perplexing questions. I think that journalists all around the world are grappling with them as well. We're seeing, the closing of the last independent media in Russia. We're seeing Indian journalists going into exile. We've seen the real muffling of journalism in China. And I think it's a challenge. I think in the beginning, journalists thought, well, if we just were super objective and we cover things fairly and we present evidence and we present facts and we do our homework, people will listen to us. And now I think there's a real questioning about whether that's even the case. Great investigative reporting is going unnoticed. Important stories are being told, but government isn't taking action. And so I think globally, there's just been a real question about the role of journalism in this sort of crazy demagogue populist era. And I'm very, very thrilled that we have such an experienced and thoughtful panel to talk about all of this. I thought maybe it would be good to start with the two journalists in the room, Ron Brownstein and Perry Bacon, and then perhaps move to the academics to provide a little bit of perspective. But really, any audience, any order is fine. And, if there's any questions from the audience, that would be terrific. And we'll have a very hard stop a little bit before 2 p.m. So thank you all and welcome. I don't know, Ron, do you want to go first or Perry?
Either way, Perry, do you want to start or should I?
Sorry, go ahead, Ron.
Well, I'll start. So first of all, thank you for doing this. To me, it's striking that we're meeting the day after the governor of Arizona signed 3 bills yesterday, one banning abortion after 15 weeks, one making it harder to vote by easing the path to push people off the voter rolls, and a third one that bars transgender girls from high school sports and also limits medical care for transgender minors. This came 2 days after Ron DeSantis signed the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. And I guess last Friday, he signed a bill that makes it easier for critics to push for the removal of books from school libraries. And it came in the same week, actually the same day, that the Oklahoma governor signed a bill prohibiting transgender athletes. Utah, a couple days ago, overrode a governor veto to do this. Georgia yesterday the legislature finished a bill like what I discussed in Florida, making it easier for critics to try to remove books from school libraries. And the Tennessee State House passed its own bill doing that on Monday. And what all of this flurry of activity really is indicative of the moment that we are living in. We are seeing, I think, the most sustained threat to the right to vote in terms of adding new restrictions, probably since the late 19th century. But even that, as momentous as it is only one component of a larger story. And the larger story is that essentially half the country, the 23 states with unified Republican control are to varying degrees and varying means, but essentially all in a similar direction. They are moving to undo, to unravel, to reverse the rights revolution of the past 6 decades, maybe even the past 7 decades, going back to Brown versus Board of Education. The general trend in American life, really at least since Brown's Board of Education, maybe since the 60s, has been to nationalize more rights and to reduce the freedom of states to diverge from that and restrict the rights of the people who live there, that your basic civil rights and civil liberties should not depend on where you live. That is now in serious threat. And in fact, you could, if you look across the country at the states that have restricted access to voting, 19 of them last year, according to the Brennan Center, just down the block, maybe more than down the block, down a few blocks from Columbia. If you look at what's happening we're now in double-digit states that are restricting LGBTQ rights. Half the states are poised to ban abortion or severely restrict it if the Supreme Court allows them. Restrictions on the way teachers talk about race and gender and sexual orientation have now moved into the double-digit categories of states, probably around 14 or 15 at this point. We are seeing more efforts to remove books, ban books from libraries, not only in local districts, the kind of historic way that this has been fought out, but now through statewide policy. And about half a dozen of these same states have significantly raised the penalties for public protest and make it easier to charge people who are engaged in protests with rioting. And some of them have even immunized drivers who run over people during protests. Also, all of this is an enormous change in the fabric of American life that is underway and is proceeding, as I'll mention in a minute, through a kind of 3 different gears that are meshing together. I think journalism is having a really hard time dealing with the magnitude of what's happening. The question of how you deal with threats to democracy in particular, as Anya mentioned, how you deal with systematic falsehoods, but also how you reckon with change that is coming, that is kind of a national movement, but is happening in a dispersed manner in states across the country, I think is very challenging for journalism. And I think we, as an institution, are failing to alert people to the magnitude of this moment. I don't think journalism is alone, by the way. I think that the people who are resisting this, the Democratic Party, the various interest groups in each vertical lane that are fighting this, have also failed to tell a story about the magnitude of what is happening. As I've written, the business community, which was initially engaged quite heavily when this current wave, I think, kicked off with the bathroom bill in North Carolina in 2016. They've withdrawn. But I think it is a special problem for journalism. Now, it is true that it is, I've been covering national politics since the 1980s, and it is always easier for journalism to kind of tell a story when the participants themselves are aggressively moving to make whatever it is into a point of dispute between the parties and a point of attention for the country. And as I said, that's not really happening. I mean, Biden is not doing it. Democrats in Congress are not doing it, although they're kind of being pulled further in this direction. So I think it is an enormous challenge for journalism, but one in which I think we are failing to give people the sense of the magnitude of what is happening, particularly on the democracy front, where it is being portrayed as another he said, she said kind of red-blue dispute between the parties. I think I've said this to Perry, we've had this conversation. I think the highest obligation we have as journalists is to tell the truth to our audience as best we can reckon it, as best we can ascertain it. And if that produces a kind of scenario in which one side in an argument feels as though you are being biased or taking a side, I think that's the consequence you have to accept. I mean, the idea that being seen as impartial if the price of being seen as impartial is denying the nose in front of your face, to paraphrase Orwell, I think that's too high a price to pay. And I think people need to push at the edge of their comfort zone to be truthful. And I guess I will stop there and say that I do believe that what we are seeing is a potential hinge point in the life of the country. I think it is occurring precisely out of the same motivations that fuel the emergence of the Trump movement, which is a significant portion of the country that is uneasy, anxious, hostile to the overlapping demographic, cultural, and economic changes that are transforming American life. But whatever the cause, the reality is that we are in a period that is much like the end of Reconstruction in 1876, where we saw the retrogression and erosion of rights in a significant portion of states across a broad range of issues. We are living in that moment, and I think journalism has to do a better job of explaining just what is at stake to the broad audience.
I thought that was a great presentation of where we are, and what I might say in terms of the political press question, just to narrow it down, I think we're in a real moment. I've been a political reporter for 20 years, a columnist just this 1 year, but 19 more in sort of more objective, quote unquote, objective roles. But anyway, to say that I think the real tension point is the primary aim of the political press to be objective or to be accurate. And I think that obviously journalists would like to be objective and accurate, but when you are which of those things is your priority is becoming really contested. The example I would give is last week, the terms heated exchange and spar were used in news coverage to describe the Supreme Court hearings. If one person is sort of shouting another with basic falsehoods, and one person is sort of meekly responding the way Judge Jackson was, is that a heated exchange? I mean, was Will Smith versus Chris Rock a heated exchange, or did one person punch the other? And or whatever the punch, I guess it was particularly a smack. Was she sparring with them or with Tom Cotton, or was Tom Cotton kind of telling her off and she was kind of delicately responding? I think that's the kind of issue where you can really see that model in tension, describing Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley's questions and their behavior accurately and like as a normal person would not seem objective, because it would make them look meaner than Judge Jackson. And you can see those things, and you can see the New York Times. There was the headline was rewritten, and the stories were rewritten a lot, because you could see that there's a site that tracks how the New York Times reads its articles. I'm sure the Post is the same issue, but when you're sort of grappling with this objective versus accurate question, you're constantly dealing with this. And it's like, and as Ron said, it's not just the media. This sort of Trump, this MAGA, this sort of international nationalist is not a way to say it, but the sort of that movement of leaders and nationalists, I'll call it for now, of people, is not just anti-press. They're in a certain way anti-empiricism, anti-facts, anti-evidence. They are weary of independent institutions that claim to speak for a higher authority than whatever party or ideology they represent. So the attacks on Fauci are not that different from the Republicans, are no different than attacks on the media, because Fauci is an institution. The attacks on public health professionals we saw over the last couple of years has the same idea. So in some ways, while journalism is maybe the most important institution dealing with these kind of challenges, the way the Trumpified wing of the Republican Party attacks sort of any kind of nonpartisan authority is important to think about. And I think that all those kinds of authority institutions need to think about themselves a little bit collectively in terms of because the question again is, how do we make sure we're listened to by both sides, so objective, but stay accurate? And I think that's a really important distinction. And I'll stop there.
This is a great discussion, and speaking with two of the best journalists out there is a great way to have this discussion. For me, to be objective and to be accurate, either if I'm writing a history book or I'm writing an opinion piece, requires acknowledging the difference between the parties. For me, this is the essence of what's going on. We have two parties that are very distinct ideologically and in terms of how they conduct partisan politics. And I think a lot of reporters are hesitant simply to say that. And obviously, if you look back historically, we've always talked about the differences within parties. If you were writing in the 1940s and 50s, you would, of course, acknowledge the liberalism of the Democratic Party in so many areas compared to where the Republican Party was after the New Deal and World War II. We talk about differences within the parties. If we're writing about the early 1960s and you're writing about Southern Democrats, you're going to have to acknowledge and talk about the system, the institutional system of racial disenfranchisement that was so distinct in the Deep South, and not kind of somehow find a comparable element with liberal Democrats like Missouri Democrat Richard Bolling or Hubert Humphrey, who were the northern liberal wing of the party. And so I think it's the job of journalists and historians to actually report on these differences. Objectivity is not saying both sides are pretty much the same or both sides are engaged in comparable behavior. It's actually writing about the differences. And, you know, for me, we have conflated two phenomena. One, which Ron has written a lot about as well, is since the 70s, we've had polarization in our political system. We've had fewer moderates in both parties. You have more homogeneity within each political party, and that's resulted in all sorts of political difficulties and challenges. The second is what's often called asymmetric polarization, and it's a difference in how polarization has played out. And basically, you say that as a whole, the Republicans moved further to the right than Democrats as a whole moved toward the left. And you see this reflected in the leadership. 2020 was Biden versus Trump, which kind of says it all. And in terms of strategy, we've seen certainly since the Newt Gingrich era in the 1980s that the Republicans have moved toward a much more aggressive, no guardrails kind of partisan warfare than Democrats have been willing to do. And I think both of those are pretty fair and accurate understandings of how the parties have evolved in different ways in this era of polarization. And I think the real problem has come for many journalists, it's been a challenge, is how do you just say that explicitly without then being accused of being partisan or being biased? To what Perry was saying, I don't know if there's a way out of that. I think part of it is journalists have to live with that, and they have to live in this environment because part of the conservative strategy, you know, has been to attack the press for this. And it doesn't really matter how or what you write. I think these attacks are coming, but it's quite urgent because of what Ron is saying to understand how this phenomena has played out. And you certainly see this obviously in the difference of the leadership of both parties, where on the Democratic side, you have a Biden and a Chuck Schumer, and on the Republican side, you have McConnell and you have Trump and you have Kevin McCarthy and the universe that they have helped to create. So for me, to be really objective and to be really accurate requires writing about this asymmetry and weaving that into stories about what's happening, whether it's the upcoming election, whether it's the January 6th and kind of attack on the election system story, or whether it's understanding why this restriction of voting rights is happening in so many red as opposed to blue states. If we don't do that, that's actually a much more biased and partisan way to try to understand Washington than actually talking about the differences with the parties.
I'm already bursting with questions, but I want to let Kim go ahead, and just also want to encourage folks that we have a chat and a Q&A box. So please, anybody with questions, feel free to put them in and I'll moderate. But Kim, please go ahead, and then I may make some comments as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think one of the reasons why I'm on this panel is that I focus on the rest of the world. There's an election coming up in Hungary on Sunday. I've lived and worked in Hungary for many years. One of the things you see when you look around the world is that democracies are collapsing everywhere in the world. And what that's accompanied by is a collapse of the press. And so as we think about the future of journalism, I hope that we can look out beyond what's happening in the US to see the cautionary tales from the rest of the world. So what are some of the things we look at by seeing what's happened to the press? I mean, as you probably seen from the headlines here, Novaya Gazeta, which was the last independent newspaper in Russia, finally closed its doors. In Hungary, there's an election campaign in which the united opposition parties simply cannot get their message through to an electorate. Yesterday, the government accused the opposition of something that had no factual basis whatsoever, and the opposition can't correct it in time for Sunday's election. So that's the world that you move into when you get an autocratic government. So it seems to me that the press is part of an ecosystem that needs to think about how to avoid the US collapse of democracy. And we're very much on the precipice of that collapse. What are some of the signs? So one of the signs, to echo what Perry said, is that it's not just journalism that's under attack. It's every independent source of evidence. It's sort of the creation of facts themselves that is really under assault. So the attacks on universities, the attacks on K through 12 schools, what Ron mentioned with book censorship, with politics sort of dominating everything, even questioning whether courts have any place to stand to actually adjudicate disputes in a way that's not entirely mired in partisanship. So there's a kind of partisanization, right, of everything, where there becomes no neutral place to stand. And frankly, what that's done is it's created an atmosphere like the schoolyard bully, right? Where everybody who thinks of themselves as just honestly trying to figure out what's going on without starting from a partisan orientation is automatically thinking about, as soon as I say this, I'm going to get beat up by somebody who disagrees with me, right? So the first thing to do is to kind of disarm the bullies, right? They can't control what our evidence shows to be the case. Right. And so what that suggests is that we need to be much more straightforward about things like, what they call in math problems, showing your work, right? How do we arrive at the conclusions we arrive at? What is the methodology that we use? And this is where it seems to me journalism is really going through a very interesting transformation in the US, because where it was once the case that it was enough to interview somebody from, quote, both sides in a two-party system, you assume that there are two sides. Now, those two sides are not really parallel, right? One side may be giving you some evidence-based statement, and the other side may be simply making something up. And when that happens, it's no longer enough to quote both sides, right? It requires a different kind of journalism in which you ask yourself, what is the evidence for the statements that you're quoting? And not necessarily to give equal play, right, to the statements for which there is no evidence. So that pushes journalists back a stage into assessing whether the people that, everybody is quoting are really the best sources to ask in the first place, and because sources are everything in journalism, just like methodology is everything in the social sciences, for example. And so we need a conversation about sources. Is it enough to go to the spokesperson of one side who is trained to put up a smoke screen against what's actually going on behind stage? Or is the point of journalism to actually look beyond that to evidence? And so here's where there are just a couple of things I've learned from watching the press in Hungary. So one is that it's extremely easy for the press to be distracted from what is going on beneath the scenes. So for example, in Hungary for many years, Viktor Orban, who is by now, an autocrat, would erect a statue to a raving anti-Semite on precisely the day that the parliament was passing complex technical laws shutting down democracy. And the press would run out to the statue because it's much easier to cover. It's got visuals, right? It's very easy to say, here's this anti-Semitic writer from the 30s. Why are they putting up a statue to him? And they'd ignore what was happening in parliament. In fact, that got to be so common that when I saw the statue going up, I'd immediately go to the parliamentary agenda and read, it could be on page 78 of a long, complex technical bill. They snuck in something, right? But it was a signal that something was happening. So the press needs to think about what's really important, and the drive for visuals, the drive for easy to understand stories really has to give way to what's actually happening to shut down democracy behind the scenes. Finally, one last point on elections. These days, Elections are not stolen on election day. It's not minor election irregularities in the voting process that is really what's tilting elections. Elections run by infrastructures of rules. And in Hungary, the election was shut down by laws Viktor Orban passed right after he was elected the first time that made it impossible for the opposition to win elections. And we're now seeing that process happening here as state legislature after state legislature are passing reasonably technical laws about who counts and how do you challenge and all these kinds of things. And again, they're the harder stories to write about because they're not visual and they're not so dramatic. And it requires some technical knowledge of how elections work. But that's where elections are stolen, not on the day of. And if journalists can start covering elections when the infrastructure is being put in place, we'll have a much better understanding of what actually happens when elections actually occur. So I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much for that. There's, as we were talking, I was thinking of things I wanted to say and things I wanted to ask. I think I'll make a comment and ask Julian a question and then come back and ask a question that builds on Mika Sifri's question. So I think the first thing I wanted to say is that I edited 2 books of investigative journalism from the Global South, Africa muckraking and global muckraking. And these go back 200 years. And we've done a lot of work at SIPA on that sort of dividing line between journalism and advocacy. And I just wanted to remind everybody that, of course, the point some of you have made that the advocacy journalism could still be incredibly accurate. So when you look at some of the abolitionist newspapers or think people like E.D. Morel, who exposed, King Leopold's brutality in the, brutal system of exploitation in the Congo. But I would also agree that in many parts of the Global South, journalists have sort of dealt with this question already, and in many places do feel that they have to be advocates as well as journalists. So I'm thinking about a lot of the work I've done in Africa. I'm thinking about my time spent in East Asia, for example. So journalists kind of straddle both of those roles in many places. My first question for the panel is really to Julian, which is, I'm so curious to know is the polarization of media consumption, and this again, we'll have to delve more into Mika's point, but all these great things that Kim is telling journalists to do, does it actually make a difference when the world is as polarized as it is? I have some thoughts about that, but Julian, I was wondering if you could give us a historical perspective on this. One of my students presented last week about how the people that were pro-slavery had their own newspapers and their own propaganda, right? So where does that, and I'm sorry that that's even the period we're comparing ourselves to, but what do you think about that?
No, and I would start by saying it's probably worse now than in earlier eras, because it's not simply a kind of partisan news, it's an entire infrastructure devoted to this, with national, international networks and websites and social media feed that is not one paper or one journalist you're talking about. It's a media world which is very hard to break, and so it lends itself to the depressing question of what difference does it make? You can put out the best journalism and put out the best stories, and you're never going to break through to people who don't want to listen to that. And there's some validity to that right now, but obviously, historically, great journalism has been able to break through different kinds of barriers. So civil rights coverage in the 1950s and 60s wasn't up exactly against what we're talking about today, but it was a world of media in the South, for example, which wouldn't cover racial violence, which would present civil rights activism as being kind of disruptive agitators who were causing problems. This was the world of newspapers in Mississippi, for example, or there was a moment when James Baldwin was on TV and they cut away all the local networks in many of the southern states. And in the end, journalism really mattered. It did kind of portray the violence and the impact of that system well. And I think you can look back and say, even with those obstacles, it had a huge impact. And fast forward just a few years later to Vietnam, it was similar kinds of challenges. I mean, the media was very reluctant to talk what was right in front of their faces of what was happening. They were listening to the Johnson spokespeople or the military spokespeople rather than doing work on the ground. But over time, journalism really mattered. I think the images and stories they brought back from Vietnam shook up the political status quo that existed until 67 or 68. And now obviously we can talk about lots of examples like that, but I still remain an optimist that it still can have a huge impact.
What I was going to say is that's actually something we looked at a lot in our two books on global muckraking and Africa muckraking, was when did the journalism make a difference? Why did an article about prison reform in 1880 suddenly catch people's attention and become salient? And what we found, trafficking, prison reform, unfair labor contracts in the 19th century, was very often there was a civil society movement that was also involved. So when there were already reformers, the journalism sort of intercepted and made a difference. We've got lots and lots of examples. In my introduction, I said that when circumstances are right, journalism can make a difference. But journalism can make sure, the circumstances are right. So I agree with you. I think there's that interplay. Another thing, and I would love to ask, anybody who wants to talk about this, but particularly the journalists on the call, is, and some of my students who've been involved in this work are on the Zoom. One of the things that we've been doing here at SEPA for the last couple of years is looking at how governments around the world are supporting journalism. And it's not just, we know that France and Denmark and Sweden give tons and tons of subsidies and support to public journalists. But since COVID, we're seeing all these exciting new initiatives. So Indonesia passed a whole bunch of tax credits to allow newspapers to hire more staff, and they waived VAT on newsprint. Tunisia also did something similar. Korea was looking at a voucher system. So we're seeing this incredible, South Africa right now is overhauling how they fund the South African Broadcasting Corporation. So we're seeing these fantastic initiatives around the world. And people like Steve Waldman have been really activists here and getting some tax credits into the Build Back Better bill. So I do agree, that boosting, and this is to Mika Sifry's point, boosting the supply is incredibly important, and making sure, the Canadians will tell you they have less polarization there because everybody's watching, the same 5 mainstream outlets. On the other hand, I also wonder how much of this is a demand side problem, which is a little bit what Julian was speaking to. And so I was wondering if the journalists on the call would like to respond to that thought, if it's relevant for the work that you do.
I guess I don't, sorry.
Go ahead, Perry. Yeah, go ahead.
I guess the data will be hard to look at here, but I still think a lot of Democrats, most Democrats, and a ton of Republicans consume what I would call the mainstream media. They're not necessarily in that Fox universe. And so what I think about is very simple, is that from November 6th, 2021, or from about November 10th, 2020 to around January 21st, 2021, the tone of the media coverage was, this guy is trying to overturn the election and we're not going to let him. And it was very explicit and very clear and very pro-democracy. There was a moment like that. That is not a media that would have hired Mick Mulvaney and made him an objective analyst on television. I think it's very worthwhile. I agree that things are happening abroad that are important to put in context. I agree that the media environment needs to grow and have more sources. But to me, NBC, CBS, ABC, the Washington Post, the New York, we need to be very clear that we have dominant news institutions that not only reach people, but shape what your news you get on Apple News or Yahoo or on Twitter or on Facebook comes often from 10 or 12 places. Politico, Axios, influence those places. What are those 10 or 12 places doing? Is their journalism more like January 8th, 2021, or more like January 2014. And right now they're back in January 8th, 2014 mode. And I think that is the question, is if their view of the world is it's closer to January 8th, 2014 than January 2021, I disagree with them, but that's how many of them look like, is that we had a moment, I think Jay Rosen said we had a pro-democracy breakthrough in the media for a few months, and it looks like that ended. And I think it's worth sort of really honing in on, if that's what our main journal institutions have decided to do, it's worth like thinking about why they decided that. And to me, it looks like a lot of, if the question is, am I objective or am I accurate? I prefer to be objective.
Yeah. Look, Kim's point earlier about looking to evidence and not just kind of balancing who you quote kind of gets at the heart of what Perry, I think, is alluding to, which is that there are conventions in journalism that are so powerful about that all of us were taught and kind of inculcated in, as we proceeded in our careers, that are so powerful that are basically built on the assumption that you have two, and this goes back to Julian's point, you have two actors that are playing the same game by the same rules. And they're legitimately debating whether the top tax rate should be 39.6 or 36, which to take something that we've kind of ping-ponged back and forth beyond. All of this just has a lot of trouble acknowledging that you may be in a different world where a significant, I would say, the dominant faction in the Republican Party at this point is not playing the same game that we have seen through most of American history, although certainly there are elements of it always in the South, for almost a century, and are moving toward positions on the kind of the core rules of democracy and truth and censorship that are outside, that are closer to what we have seen in countries like Hungary, and the press just has enormous difficulty saying that. And to the extent they have, as Perry, I think, very perceptively points out, the kind of the inertia, the pull back to the pre-existing view is powerful enough that CBS could hire Mick Mulvaney because they think Republicans are going to be controlling Congress without dealing with his role in legitimate threats to democracy. And you get into a construct where you are covering whether American democracy will survive as like just another tug of war between red and blue, and assessing that Democratic voters don't seem to really care about this issue, which, by the way, is largely true at the moment, and a failure of the party. But that, I guess I would say, this does not belong in that construct, right? It doesn't, like, to the extent that we are witnessing threats to basic underpinnings of our political and constitutional order, the core issue is not which party this advantages in the next election. And it's just very hard for the press to do that. It's harder, as I said, when other institutions are not doing that, and by and large they're not. But it is a failure nonetheless.
Yeah, I don't know if Anya, I can jump in here, because I think what this is raising is, the question of what values do journalists hold, and are they willing to defend them, right? And I remember a book going way back, Herb Gans's book, Deciding What's News, right? Where he showed that, journalists do have a set of values, right, that they promote. And now journalists are on the defensive about any values. So is it partisan to say that democracy is a better system of government than autocracy? That used to be a kind of assumed baseline among journalists, and now it looks like a partisan position, right? So what's happened is that things that used to be taken for granted values on which journalistic practice is based are now contested. So that's why journalism is kind of caught in this difficulty. But I don't think, a free press exists in order to defend democratic institutions. And if you've got actors that are trying to seize power, make sure it never rotates, eliminate checks and balances, capture independent institutions, bully journalists, pack courts. All of those things are the slippery slope into autocracy. And if journalism doesn't think that those are also threats to its own practice, as well as to democracies, that free presses are, they're an institution of democracy. They're not irrelevant to the existence of democracy. So all those things strike me, they must be defended. And as Anya was mentioning, there are a lot of these experiments now in different countries to have state supportive media. And, what the elephant in the room here has to do with the changing economic basis of media. And we've just been through this near-death experience of, daily newspapers and, of all of the, of whether advertising is sufficient to carry the press to a kind of situation in which it can be vibrant and independent. And I'm not sure that the new model is working so well. So the first model that's not working so well is that, of course, in television, having a kind of lane in which you swim, a kind of base, like a political party base, has become the way to generate enough viewers, to generate enough advertisers, et cetera. So there's nothing much to be gained by alienating all sides, for example, or by, not having a base that you play to. And that's an economic reality now. Public media in Europe, for example, are designed to kind of rise above the political fray and be nonpartisan and not have to worry about how they're funded. But of course, the problem with publicly funded media is what we've seen in Poland and in Hungary, where as soon as you get an autocratic party in power, they capture that public media and it becomes their biggest, a bullhorn. So this is where it seems to me that the pluralism of the media, pluralism of funding models, pluralism of sort of points of view is actually probably the media's best defense. And I think that it's important to defend that pluralism against various forms of capture. And just one last thing, because of the economics of the media, it's become very expensive to go out and report. And we've switched over to a kind of pundit model of journalism where, everybody on this call is reading what everybody else is writing and commenting on it without necessarily going out to the field and doing firsthand research. And because that kind of journalism has become very expensive to produce, and that's been the casualty. I might also add just one last thing. When I was a journalist a long time ago, and one of the things I did was I was one of the people who helped set up the NBC News internal polling operation. And that was the media used to be the ones who paid for the electoral polling. The media who wanted accuracy paid for the electoral polling. Well, that went with the precariousness of the financial base of the media. So now almost all the polls we're reporting on are polls being fielded by the political organizations themselves. So it's absolutely no wonder why none of our election predictions ever work out, because in fact, there are hardly any neutral polling outfits, and yet the press reports polls as if that underlying shift hadn't happened, right? So there's an economic revolution behind this that has made it much more difficult for the press to maintain its balance.
It's still hard. If I could just add one thing, I mean, there is the argument for sure that journalists can have values, and those values, such as pro-democracy, can inform what they do. But it seems like you don't even have to go that far to ask the question of kind of how can a story like the one that unfolded from November to today of a political party systematically going after an election where the story just keeps getting bigger. I mean, every day there's a new piece of evidence about yet another prominent Republican who is involved, or missing tapes or missing recordings, as we're phone calls, as we're hearing yesterday, and senators involved in this, and local officials being pressured. And I don't know, there's an element, whatever your values, there should be a way to report on that, and not just kind of as another story, which is how you will read it on any feed, but a fundamental moment in the history of the democracy, where from the president of the United States at the time to leading congressional leaders, they knew what they were doing. They were engaged in a pretty systematic effort. And it's continuing right through today with local election officials and Secretary of State campaigns. And I don't know what, I mean, maybe Ron and Perry can talk about kind of how do you convey that as a reporter? If you go back to Watergate coverage, where in some ways now the scandal seems smaller than today, reporters were able to convey why this was a turning point story, and you had to follow it. And it meant a lot to figure out kind of how this went to the present. Whereas today, I don't get how it's just one other story.
It's interesting to think, Julian, how Watergate might have unfolded in the modern media environment with this closed circuit, under the dome conservative media transmission system, Fox and talk radio and the websites. And, would Nixon's approval rating among Republicans and his support among Republicans in Congress have fallen as far or as fast with that out there saying constantly, this is a plot by godless, secular, transgender urban Democrats to undermine the silent majority and to take control of the country? They're not attacking him, they're attacking you, which is essentially Trump's response to everything. And that goes to the larger problem. I was thinking as we were talking of a comment that Obama made somewhere toward the end of his presidency, where he said there was no way for him to reach a big chunk of red America except through the filter of Fox News. That there was no other place he could put himself or his comments that they would see it. In the Pew studies of media consumption, a much higher share, triple a share of Republicans pick Fox as their primary source of news than pick anything on the Democratic side. On the Democratic side, there's nothing above like 20%, which is some combination of the New York Times, PBS, NPR, CNN. I mean, they're all maybe 18%. And whereas on the Republican side, Fox is just in such a dominant position. And part of the answer to your question, goes to the fact that there is a portion of the country that is beyond, I think at this point, beyond the reach of the mainstream media in any meaningful way. But it is not, that is not a majority of the country by any means. And I do believe it is a failure to, as I said at the beginning, to kind of grapple with the magnitude of the moment that we are in. Most pointedly, the threats to democracy, but also the broader way in which we are moving, I think, into a different era in civil rights and civil liberties, in which the way you live in half the country is about to be very different than the way you live in the other half of the country. And as you saw in comments from Marsha Blackburn and Mike Braun and John Cornyn, the kind of targets that we're seeing now are not the end of the line. I mean, it's not abortion and voting rights and LGBTQ rights and classroom censorship. I mean, we are seeing people talking about same-sex marriage again, and interracial marriage and contraception, and bills that would impose limits not only on school, but also public libraries. So, I mean, I think we are at a hinge point. I have not studied the coverage of the 1870s and 1880s and the extent to which there was broad awareness that the South was being allowed to move into a very repressive system. I do know that Plessy versus Ferguson got very little coverage when it happened. There was almost no press coverage of it. So I do think we are in a moment of just an extraordinary hinge point in the life of the country, and one in which could carry us to a very different future. And while there is a portion of the country that is beyond the reach of journalism to tell that story, it is not a majority of the country. And there is a need to tell the story, just as there's a need for every other institution in society to step up the way it is engaging with what's happening.
Any final thoughts or questions from the audience or comments from the panelists? I know I certainly want to sum up.
Yeah. If I can just say one quick thing in response to Ron, excuse me, which is that culture war issues are the ultimate distraction. Right. And given a choice between library censoring books and having an election which is thrown out and the bums stay when the voters threw them out, those are not parallel events, and so I'm worried that the culture war stuff is getting way too much attention relative to the collapsing democracy stuff. And
Kim,
it's
I actually
important.
feel it's part of the same continuum. I mean, I wrote a story. I mean, if you look at what's happening, I think that by and large, these restrictions are for the not entirely, but Perry, I think, would agree, are advancing most aggressively in states that are seeing the most demographic change, where you have younger generations that are majority kids of color at this point, in some cases, super majorities, kids of color. And you have, I think, a two-pronged approach. I mean, you have laws that are designed to shape the electorate today, and then you have laws that are designed to shape the electorate tomorrow by limiting what they are told about racial inequities, both historic and current. I mean, I believe that, you know, that all of these culture war school bans are being framed as a way to protect the feelings of white kids. They're mostly being passed in states where a majority of the public school kids are already Black and brown and Asian. And I think it's really more about shaping their understanding of the circumstances in which they live. So I look at all of this as part of one, and the abortion and everything else, as a way to kind of enshrine the values of one group, older white cultural conservatives, in a country in which they are moving more clearly into minority status every day. And I think it's all a continuum, and the voting is the most pointed, you know, as you say, it is the point of the spear, but I think it's all one spear myself.
I don't know if we're allowed to argue back, but all I want to say is that to win elections in this kind of polarized space, as we're seeing in Hungary, you have to form big tent coalitions. And that means, for example, if Democrats are going to win, bringing over independents and homeless Republicans. And a lot of the culture war issues are designed to split those groups, precisely so that the forces of democracy, so to speak, the people who are in favor of checks and balances, rotation of power, and so on, will be split and will not form a cohesive group to win the next election. So, and of course, the culture war issues are designed precisely to make everyone think those are the most important things, but you don't win on any of those things if you lose the democracy.
Yeah, fair point.
Any other comments before I come in? No? Okay, just two closing thoughts. One is I've been writing quite a bit about media literacy movement at Columbia in the 1930s. And it was so similar to today, where there was this feeling that propaganda was taking over the world. And so former journalists and sociologists got together to try to work with school children to make them more critical of propaganda and more skeptical. And many of the people involved in that movement were also involved in a movement to promote anti-racist education, which, as you all know, was a really big deal in the 1920s and 30s. And it's just so disheartening to see that they were attacked. Those programs were shut down in the 1920s and 30s. And it was very similar to what's happening today, where there was just, you know, a core of people that just didn't want kids to learn that, you know, Islam or Judaism was as good as Catholicism. They didn't want kids to learn anti-racist curriculum. And if anyone's interested, I know someone who's actually writing a PhD right now on anti-racist education movement in New York, but there's also work that's been done on Springfield, Massachusetts, and the programs there. So I thought that was an interesting historical footnote. In terms of journalism, I mean, I think I just want to close on a note of gratitude and reverence. Around the world, journalists are risking themselves enormously. I mean, you probably saw that Rana Ayub was stopped from flying out of India this week, and she was supposed to address all of us at the International Journalism Festival in Italy next week. So around the world, there are journalists who are putting themselves in harm's way. They're getting put in jail. They're getting shot at. And they're not stopping. Again, you know, compared to 200 years ago, 100 years ago, the amount of investigative reporting we have now, the cross-border investigative reporting, is just unbelievable. And I think all of you on this Zoom, the journalists as well as the academics, have done more than your fair share. So I just wanted to end on a note of thanks. I really do believe that great journalism, you know, may not solve our problems, but
we're not going to solve it without it. And, obviously I read the Atlantic and the Washington Post every single day, and Julian's work, and now I'm going to start reading Kim's work. So just want to say a big thanks to all of you for all you've done to preserve our democracy, as well as to our audience for showing up today. So thank you very much. And I'll let you get on to your classes and meetings and stories. I'll end this now. Thank you. Really, really great to see you all.